When World War II finally ended, the world didn't just rebuild, it was completely redrawn. We're about to dive into this incredible, explosive era of decolonization, a time when centuries old empires just crumbled and dozens of new nations were born. So, have you ever really looked at a modern map and wondered how it got that way? Because it wasn't a quiet, neat process. Nope. It was a story of revolution, of fierce conflict, and of a desperate struggle for a new identity on the world stage. Okay, so first things first, the old European colonial powers. We're talking Britain, France, the Netherlands. They were exhausted, completely drained by the war, economically shattered. Their grip on these huge overseas territories just started to slip. The age of empire was ending, and fast. And as those old empires faded, two new giants rose to take their place: the United States and the Soviet Union. They basically carved the world into two opposing teams, locking everyone into a brand new kind of global fight: the Cold War. Right in the middle of this superpower clash, dozens of colonies across Asia and Africa saw their chance. They seized it, and let me tell you, their independence wasn't just handed over, it was won through protest, through tough negotiations, and more often than not, through brutal, fiery conflict. So let's really get into what this new world actually looked like. Because this huge wave of decolonization didn't happen in a bubble. It all went down on a global stage that had been completely turned upside down. On one side, you had the US and its Western allies. They were all about capitalism, they had their NATO military alliance, and their main goal was to stop the spread of communism. And on the other side, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, pushing communism through their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. It was a rigid, bipolar world. And these two superpowers became the main event. They weren't just watching from the sidelines, oh no. They saw this decolonizing world as a giant chessboard, a crucial arena where they could fight for influence. This turned local independent struggles into global proxy wars, where they'd back opposing sides instead of fighting each other head-on. Okay, so let's dig into this a bit, because getting freedom wasn't a one-size-fits-all deal. And to see just how different the paths could be, we're going to look at two huge examples from Asia: British India and French Indochina. What's so fascinating here is just how stark the contrast is. I mean, look at this. In India, the fight against the British was famously led by Mahatma Gandhi, all through nonviolence. But over in French Indochina, Ho Chi Minh led a straight-up armed guerrilla war. We're talking two totally different playbooks to reach the exact same goal. Gandhi's whole philosophy of civil disobedience was, frankly, revolutionary. It got millions of Indians on their feet, not with guns, but with this incredible moral and political will that the British Empire, at the end of the day, just couldn't break. But here's the absolute tragedy of it all. Even though the struggle against Britain was largely nonviolent, independence in 1947 came at a horrific price: the partition of the subcontinent based on religion. The creation of India and Pakistan unleashed just unimaginable violence and one of the largest, most painful mass migrations in human history. Meanwhile, the French just refused to let go of Indochina. So what happened? A long, bloody guerrilla war led by Ho Chi Minh. And it all came to a head in 1954 at a place called Dien Bien Phu, where Vietnamese forces pulled off a stunning victory, absolutely crushing a modern European army and forcing France to the negotiation table. All right, now let's shift our focus to Africa, because as this wave of independence swept across the continent, the birth of new nations was, believe it or not, often even more chaotic and violent. The Congo is just a heartbreaking case study. Belgium basically just dropped independence on them in 1960, with no local leaders ready, no stable institutions, nothing. Chaos erupted almost instantly. The mineral-rich province of Katanga broke away with Western support. The country's first elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated, and the whole nation just spiraled into a brutal proxy war between the US and the Soviets. And then you have Algeria. You see, France didn't see Algeria as just another colony. For them, it was part of France. And that led to an unbelievably brutal 8-year war. The whole conflict was defined by torture and terrorism on both sides, and it nearly tore French society apart before Algeria finally won its independence. So, with all these brand new countries popping up on the map, they all faced the same huge question: how do we avoid just becoming pawns in this game between America and the Soviet Union? And this is where a really powerful idea comes into play.
In 1952, this term Third World was born. And it wasn't about being poor, not at all. It was a political statement. The idea was to draw a parallel to the Third Estate from the French Revolution. You know, the common people who were basically everybody but had no power. These new nations wanted to be that third force, independent of both superpowers.
And this wasn't just some abstract idea. It quickly became a real movement. The big turning point was the Bandung Conference in 1955. Leaders from 29 African and Asian nations got together for the very first time. And that meeting laid the groundwork for the formal creation of the non-aligned movement in 1961, a whole block of countries determined to chart their own course. At Bandung, they hammered out these 10 core principles, which were basically their vision for a new kind of world. You know, simple but powerful stuff. Respect every nation's sovereignty. Don't interfere in other countries' business. Recognize that all races are equal. And solve your problems peacefully. It was an incredibly ambitious vision. But, as always, idealism has a way of running into a wall of reality. That spirit of Bandung was powerful, for sure, but it couldn't just magically erase deep, long-standing conflicts. The most obvious example was the bitter rivalry between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, two of the movement's key members. It really showed the limits of their solidarity. And as you can see here, the movement was far from a united front. I mean, it had these deep cracks running right through it. On one end, you had India arguing for pure neutrality. Then you had countries like Indonesia pushing for a more aggressive anti-colonial stance. And then you had Cuba arguing they should all just form a natural alliance with the Soviets, which you can imagine threatened to tear the whole idea of being non-aligned apart from the inside. Which brings us to today, right? The Cold War's over, that bipolar world that gave birth to the non-aligned movement is gone. But that desire for nations to forge their own path, to be free from the influence of the world's great powers, well, that feels more relevant than ever. So it leaves us with a big question. In the 21st century, what does it really mean to be non-aligned?